In Atlanta, 2023. A community's faith shattered in a single night. A pastor. A married woman. A secret that turned violent. You're looking at the weapon that ended a marriage, a career, and a lie. But this isn't just about one moment. It's about the lies that built up to it. They seemed perfect. The golden couple. The devoted pastor. But behind closed doors, a different story. Here's what you won't hear in the headlines. 70% of domestic violence cases start with emotional betrayal, gaslighting, manipulation, the slow unraveling of trust. What happens when the man of God becomes the monster? And how do you rebuild when the person you trusted most betrays you? Hit subscribe. This story isn't just shocking, it's a warning. And when the screen fades, the questions stay with you. Imagine this. A quiet Tuesday evening. A dim classroom. Sunlight fades through dusty windows, casting shadows on empty desks. Leila Washington sits alone, her hands trembling over her phone. She's not grading papers. She's texting her husband's best friend. Tonight. A question that holds a lifetime of guilt. How do you walk away from a love that feels like sin? How do you tell the man you vowed to cherish that you're already cheating? Leila didn't plan this. It started with a quick hello after church, a shared laugh over coffee. They told themselves it was harmless. But secrets have a way of growing. Now here she is, trapped between her wedding vows and a love that consumes her. What happens when love becomes a prison? When the person you're supposed to trust becomes your jailer? Share this video with someone who's ever felt trapped by love. Their keeps these stories alive. Stephen Green wasn't just a pastor. He was Atlanta's moral compass. He preached sermons so fiery, they could have set the pews ablaze. Adultery is a sin that destroys families, he'd roar, slamming down Proverbs 6 verse 32. But what did he do in private? That same Bible lies open on his desk ignored, while he texts Leila, "I can't stop thinking about you." Hypocrisy isn't a flaw. It's a choice. Stephen chose to hide behind a pulpit while his life crumbled. How do you condemn sin when you're the one committing it? How do you look your congregation in the eye after you've broken every rule? This wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal of trust. A pastor's duty is to heal, not harm. But Stephen's sin wasn't just sexual, it was spiritual. He sold his soul for a moment of pleasure. And the price? A marriage, a career, and a community's faith. Terrence Washington was the picture of devotion. He'd planned Leila's wedding down to the last rose. He'd even bought her a Bible with, "To my forever love," scribbled inside. But there was one thing he never imagined, his best man betraying them. Marriage vows are public promises, private lies. Terrence trusted Stephen with his wife, his home, his heart. But Stephen's friendship with Leila wasn't innocent. It was a slow-motion betrayal. How do you rebuild when the person you called brother becomes your enemy? Terrence's world was built on trust. Now, it's crumbling. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about losing faith, in love, in trust, in the people you thought you knew. And once that faith shatters, what's left? The church office was supposed to be their safe spot, a place where no one would find them. But that night, it felt less like sanctuary and more like a tomb. Leila Washington stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass. Stephen Green's hands shook as he reached for her. "We can fix this," he whispered. But his voice cracked, like the wedding photo shattered on the floor. Could they? Or was this the moment their lies finally caught up? This wasn't passion anymore. It was desperation. A last grasp at something they knew they shouldn't want. Leila's wedding ring glinted under the dim light, a silent accusation. "One more time," she thought. "Then I'll end it." But endings are never that clean. What happens when love becomes a funeral march? When the people you love most become your executioners. Terrence Washington wasn't looking for trouble that night. He was looking for answers. Why was Leila's car missing? Why hadn't she answered her phone? The rain poured as he raced through Atlanta's empty streets, his tires splashing puddles like blood. He didn't plan to storm in. He just wanted to know. Through the window, he saw Stephen's hand on Leila's arm. Then, their lips. Time slowed. The world narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat, thunderous, drowning out the storm. How do you process betrayal? Do you scream? Do you fight? Terrence did neither. He stood there, frozen, as the truth crystallized. His marriage was a lie. And when lies harden into truth, they break bones. This wasn't just about Leila. It was about trust, something you can't rebuild once it's gone. The door smashed open. Glass shattered. Stephen and Leila froze. Terrence's face was a mask of rage. "How could you?" he screamed. The letter opener, a mundane tool for propping open Bibles, flew through the air. This wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. Leila's scream pierced the chaos. "I've destroyed us all," she wailed. But destruction is irreversible. The photo frame cracks. The vows splinter. And Stephen? He collapses, clutching his eye, whispering, "Why? Why? Why?" Violence doesn't solve betrayal. It just multiplies it. And now, there was no going back. The church filled with sirens. Detectives arrived. Leila, covered in blood, sobbed into her hands. Stephen's eye was bandaged, but the damage to his reputation? Irreparable. Terrence sat in shock, the weight of what he'd done settling like a coffin. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of loss. The loss of trust, the loss of innocence, the loss of any future they'd imagined. And the worst part? There were no winners. Only survivors. Keep watching. The fallout is worse than the crime itself. The police station was cold, sterile, a far cry from the storm outside. Terrence Washington slumped in a plastic chair, his hands caked with blood, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to kill him," he repeated, over and over, like a mantra. But intent doesn't matter when a letter opener pierces an eye. "Detective, you walked in with a weapon. You knew what you'd find. Why didn't you just leave?" He couldn't answer. How do you explain rage that turns love into violence? How do you justify destroying the life you vowed to protect? Leila's breakdown was quieter, but no less devastating. "I loved him both ways," she whispered. "I loved my husband, and I loved Stephen. How do you choose?" Her words hung in the air, a confession, a plea, an accusation against a world that demands perfection. This wasn't just about one night. It was about years of unspoken needs, of love that curdled into obsession. The next morning, Atlanta's headlines blared, "Pastor's affair ends in bloody cataclysm." TikTok theorists devoured the drama. "He's a wolf in shepherd's clothing," one video ranted, looping footage of Stephen's sermon. Another clip zoomed in on Leila's blood-stained dress. Did she plan this all along? The public craved villains. They called Terrence a crazy ex, Stephen a hypocrite, Leila a homewrecker. But real life isn't a hashtag. It's messy, raw, and unforgiving. A viral clip of Stephen's sermon went viral, with captions, "Preaching fire, living brimstone." Gossip becomes a weapon in the digital age. And when your life becomes a spectacle, there's no hiding. How do you rebuild when your shame is public property? A week after the attack, Stephen Green sat in a hospital bed, his left eye bandaged like a ghost, a tombstone for the man he once was. The nurses called him Pastor Steve out of habit, but the title felt like a punchline. He'd lost his church, his family, his dignity. All that remained was guilt, a slow bleed that no stitches could stop. The news played on a flickering TV in his room. Pastor's affair rocks Atlanta church. A reporter's voice droned. Many are asking, could this happen in your community? Stephen stared at the screen, numb. This wasn't a scandal, it was an execution. How does a hypocrite repent? Stephen tried. He fasted. He prayed. He even reached for his Bible. But the pages felt cursed. Whoever commits adultery lacks sense. The words haunted him. He'd preached judgment for years. Now, he was the sinner on the cross. Here you go, brother, the volunteer says, smiling. Stephen freezes. The word brother, once a bond, now feels like a blade. He mumbles a thank you, his voice cracking. A man at the table mutters, "Ain't that the TV pastor?" Laughter erupts. Stephen's face flushes red. The shelter isn't sanctuary, it's a mirror. Redemption isn't a moment, it's a. Stephen knew this. But how do you rebuild faith when you've burned the church to the ground? He tried to pray. "Forgive me," he whispered. But the words tasted like ash. This wasn't just a downfall. It was an unraveling. The man of God was a fraud. The revered leader was a liar. And the devout husband, a ghost. "I'm not a sinner," he told a counselor once. "I'm a monster. The moth, the blood, the vows." Patterns repeat. Stephen couldn't escape them. Not in the shelter, not in his nightmares. How do you outrun a past that's everywhere and nowhere? Forgiveness isn't a choice. It's a wound. And Stephen? He was still waiting for it to heal. Comment below. Can forgiveness exist after betrayal? Your thoughts help shape our next story. Terrence Washington's cell was a concrete tomb, grime streaking the walls, a rusted sink, and a cot that smelled of mildew. But every night, he sat on the floor, back against the door, scribbling on prison-issued paper with a dull pencil. The tip broke often, smudging the words into blurred confessions. "I'm sorry," he wrote. "I'm sorry," he wrote. "I'm sorry." The letters were never meant to leave his cell. To Leila, "I never meant for this to happen. You deserved better." To his mother, "I let you down. Forgive me." Even to his unborn child, "I hope you find love that doesn't destroy you." Each word was a nail in a coffin. His own. The guards called him Mr. Perfect, a sneer for the life he'd lost. "You think you're too good for this place?" a guard jeered one night, kicking his cot. Terrence didn't answer. He knew the truth. He wasn't perfect. He was a man who loved Leila with a possessiveness that bordered on obsession. A man who'd let jealousy turn into a blade. In counseling sessions, he unraveled. "I thought if I took him out," he muttered, voice raw, "it would make it right. That I could go back to." His breath hitched. "But I can't. There's no going back. I destroyed everything." Redemption wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a slow, painful stitch, each letter a thread, each apology a wound picked open. And Terrence? He wasn't healing. He was surviving. Clinging to the hope that somewhere, Leila was alive. That their child would grow up knowing their father's regret, not his rage. In the end, all he could do was write. And wait. And wonder if forgiveness was a bridge he'd ever cross. Leila Washington walked back into her classroom with a courage she didn't feel. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor, each step echoing like a confession. The desks were half empty. Parents had withdrawn their children, citing moral concerns. Whispers followed her down the hallway. "That woman, the pastor's affair." But Leila didn't cry. Not anymore. There was only quiet determination, a resolve that felt more like survival than strength. Every day was a battle. Some days, it was easier to give up, to let the whispers drown her out. But then she'd look at her students, their eager faces, their small hands reaching for answers, and something inside her stirred. "Be brave, not perfect," she told a shy girl named Maria, who hesitated to raise her hand. The words hung in the air, heavy but hopeful. They weren't just advice for Maria, they were a lifeline for Leila herself. Her classroom window overlooked the church where it all began. Some days, she stared at it for hours, wondering, could she forgive herself before others forgave her? Or would the weight of what happened keep pulling her under? The church wasn't just a building, it was a reminder of every lie, every touch, every broken promise. And yet, it was also where she'd danced with Terrence, where she'd believed in forever. But there were moments, small, fragile moments, that kept her going. A boy named Jamal once asked, "Why do people hurt each other?" Leila paused, her throat tight. She thought of Stephen's hands on her shoulders, of Terrence's shattered gaze when he found them. "Sometimes," she said finally, her voice steady, "people forget how to love. But we keep trying anyway." This wasn't a happy ending. It was a fragile truce, a promise to keep stitching the pieces back together, even when they cut you. Leila knew she might never be whole again. But maybe, just maybe, she could find enough fragments to build something new. Something honest. Something real. Stephen Green's left eye stayed bandaged. Not out of shame, but habit. At the shelter, he served meals, fixed roofs, and avoided crosses. But one rainy night, he found a child's Bible on a bench. "To err is human," he whispered, tracing the words. "To forgive." His voice cracked. "Well, that's the hard part." A volunteer once asked him, "Do you believe in God?" Stephen stared at the moth circling a bulb, a ghost of the church office. "I used to," he said. "Now, I just believe in trying." Redemption isn't a destination. It's a question. Can you keep walking when the world, and your past, are pulling you under? In a city built on secrets, trust is the ultimate gamble. It can bind us together, or tear us apart. For Terrence, Leila, and Stephen, the choices they made rewrote their lives forever. But even in the ruins of betrayal, there's a chance to rebuild. Not perfectly, not easily, but piece by piece. Because when one door closes, another opens, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. And it's up to us to decide whether we walk through. Next week, a nurse's deadly obsession with a patient. Will you be there? Subscribe now. Don't miss the next chapter of Vic's True Crime Stories. Share this with your true crime crew. Their likes, comments, and shares help bring these stories to more people like them who love uncovering the truth.